entailed just providing a little intro for part 2 of the 2-part series, the grotesque type in propaganda, but also kind of seizing the opportunity because since the making of this stuff, which was about 3 weeks ago, there have been some very big developments here in the UK. Suddenly, part of what I'm saying is addressing very up-to-date current issues. So partly with that in mind, just to sort of give a nod to that, to acknowledge it, and also perhaps whilst looking at as what's presented in these 2 videos, consider what you would personally say is the chain of persuasive, if you like, propagandist, in my view, image use, and actually, you know, what could it lead to? What when there's a great proliferation of a particular type of attitude or mindset, could that erupt into the sort of behaviour that actually we're now seeing here in the UK? I am not going to answer that question in this video because I wasn't going to answer that question originally, and I'd much rather pose the question. So yeah, thanks for having watched part 1. If you haven't, definitely watch part 1, and thanks for hanging about for part 2. I hope it's helpful, and not just helpful but enjoyable as well, and I'll see you again soon with a new video once I work out what the next one's going to be about. Thank you, bye. Cartoons. We've seen a lot of graphic work here, you know, and the sort of more graphic type of visual aesthetics are used in cartoons, and they're used in animation. This is a particularly very effective medium that was used. Unfortunately, I know from experience trying to do it before that if I try to change my PowerPoint into an MP4, it doesn't actually show videos. I just end up with like a kind of one image, which might not necessarily be a very good image. So I'm just including some film stills here. I'll include the titles so that you can then go on and look at the animations. I mean, it's not just the film still, it's the whole animation that's really effective. And I'd have to say, a really especially quite creative outlet, I think, for creative people in a very restrictive regime. See what you think, and that doesn't mean at all that I agree with the messages of those animations, just to be clear about that, if I needed to be. Yeah, so animations are very expensive in these times. You think how expensive they are to make now. They were even more expensive when animation was a much newer medium and everything had to be done manually, frame by frame. So they had to be worth the time and the expense. In a vast continental territory, like the USSR, cinemas were important in getting the message everywhere. The animations would have been opening features for the famous propaganda films. Using the cinema also ensured that the same message got everywhere, and the grotesque type was the same grotesque type everywhere that you sent it. In both regimes, it was only graphic arts and animation that were touched by any kind of artistic innovation. While Soviet Russia began as quite accepting of modernist styles, this changed to a kind of heroic style in painting, in fine arts. They were called socialist realism. Visually, it looks like a kind of academic painting from the 19th century, and it's rather kitsch, like kitsch images. But you know, the point is the heroizing of the proletariat. The point isn't you know, making advancements in art necessarily. The Third Reich absolutely rejected the avant-gardes of the early 20th century. Despite Germany being one of its centres up until about 1930, they called it degenerate. I want to do a future video about the exhibition of degenerate art that was held by the Nazis in 1937, as it's a very interesting subject. Perhaps degenerate style was appropriate for degenerate subjects, which is why there was more space for innovation in propaganda graphics and animations, whereas in the fine arts, there was very restricted. That kind of thing was just off limits. The only thing to add about these regimes is that they became each other's target groups. Germany and Russia had made the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939. They agreed not to step on one another's toes in their ambitions. When the Germans broke the pact in 1941, they were, of course, enemies, and grotesque types of one another proceeded. So we have examples of the grotesque type from the past. Are grotesque types a thing of the past? Let me introduce this guy, who may well be familiar to you. He's much more familiar by sight than by name, but he does go by the name Crying Wojak. In the original Polish, Wojak means soldier. He originated in the world of online gaming, so his original purpose wasn't in enemy identification, but just in cordial banter between gamers. He's a development from the He's a development from the original Wojak, who was called No Feels Guy. Little picture of him there, who actually represented the gamer who didn't give anything away. Original Wojak had a kind of poker face, you know. At some point, for amusement, someone created an opposite to the No Feels Guy, someone who's very distracted. And he became a recyclable image, which began to be used in spheres unrelated to gaming, and eventually completely disconnected from it, and used widely in many places by many groups to make many points. So he's not a custom-made grotesque type. He's an appropriated one, but he's got what we expect to find in a grotesque type. He's got grounds for dismissal, and they are very evident in his famous face. He is highly emotional. He's actually a combination of upset, look at the streaming tears, angry, maddened, the sense of sort of inner turmoil. He's not in control of himself, and this is taken to be grounds for dismissal. Emotion and passion are presented as that which discredit a person, which make what they say and do dismissible. I notice being bald with a beard seems to be grounds for dismissal too. So maybe I've been wasting your time so far, apologies. He has a common counterpart, often referred to as Yes Chad, or just Chad. He's the foil for Crying Wojak, and he displays the grounds for recommendation. He has a still, straight, calm expression shown in profile, and is often shown giving very succinct, even one-word responses, such as yes, which is how he gets the name Yes Chad. He also originated from online gaming, where he was called Nordic Gamer. You find many, many examples of these two together, and the dynamic is clear. Crying Wojak is the grotesque. He discredits himself through being himself, and represents the view that's set for ridicule and negation, and confirmed by Yes Chad. He doesn't respond passionately, so he wins, and it's about winning. This isn't a forum for analysis. The grotesque, the ideal, and that visual dynamic are not tied to one cause. It's not just the left versus the right, or the right versus the left. These two are used by both. They're not limited to areas of political or social debate at all. They're used within fandoms, I've seen, of different types of popular fiction. They used to target people with what's considered a false view just within those fandoms. Being ultimately fans of the same thing seems to go out the window. They used to target people with different dietary habits, not identical lifestyle in one way or another from the group creating the image. So they're certainly employed in support of social prejudices of our time. So yeah, some of these, I've said about there's like kind of widespread use, and sometimes it seems rather sort of surface level and superficial, but certainly you'll see them used in examples for evidence of the socially prejudiced in our time. And occasionally political prejudice. As far as I know, stopping short of saying dispense with, the last dis word, unless they do exist, but they're just being censored, and so I've not so far, thankfully, had access to those. So with Crying Wojak, we see there's been a switch in the underlying grounds for dismissal again, since the examples from the 30s and 40s. If you remember, James Gilray's working class and the emancipated black population were a bad basic. Well, they were portrayed as a bad basic. They were childlike, animalistic, etc. But then the enemies of the Soviets and the Nazis were portrayed as a bad non-basic. They were crafty, calculating. Now, Crying Wojak is back again to bad basic because he's unrestrained and he's ruled by his emotions. And Yes Chad is the good non-basic. He's on top of his emotions and is presented as having a rational grasp on whatever issue or idea is the focus. That's what's implied to enable him to make these often succinct responses, his yes responses. Crying Wojak is often shown using more words, which is supposed to belie his inner instability. He has to try harder than Yes Chad and is negated through that visible effort. I've seen firsthand how effective that implication can be on people. When I've been in online discussions, people have said I've discredited myself exactly by showing I'm able to articulate my thoughts. But, simply because too many words are present in my response, I've dismissed myself. Presumably they wouldn't be very impressed by these videos. The masked Crying Wojak can be used to express this idea. He's giving a front of confidence and assuredness, but he's actually struggling behind the mask. If you're the one doing the targeting and the trend requires you to be of the good, non-basic type, then pushing for your collectedness and control over emotion is key. We already saw this with James Gilray back in 1798. By presenting the working class as he did, he implies that through his very ability to be disparaging and aloof, that he is not paranoid about the working class. He's broadcasting, that about his nature and how calm and in control he is, or he thinks, that works, that, you can only be sort of aloof and disparaging if you are, collected and calm within yourself. We can ask how well that works, but the same tactic is still in use. I've seen a circulated meme on social media, I won't say which platform, where a Crying Wojak visually broadcast to be someone of trans identity, so they've doctored the cartoon image in ways you can probably imagine, tells a Yes Chad that he is transphobic. The Yes Chad, with characteristic calm and succinctness, replies, "I'm not afraid of you." Full stop. The calm and the full stop are strongly intended to communicate, "I win," of course. These memes aren't a discussion forum, they're there to show how the right person wins. Leaving aside that the meme creator in this case has misunderstood the meaning of phobia in clinical usage, we see that this is intended to be a denial of fear and a reversal of the accusation. When contributors work independently from their sort of own one-person propaganda ministry, as they tend to do today, the arguments are likely to be less robust. There's less people behind it, there's less analysis before something goes live. So more of what they'll assume to be hidden about themselves is in fact visible. Some meme makers are creating content about these issues daily, to meet the demands of the allies they're trying to find online. Well, that kind of repeated regular activity actually demonstrates someone is fixated. They're fixated with that target group that apparently they're completely ambivalent and aloof and disparaging towards. Presenting calmly through a kind of a Yes Chad image can't cover that up forever. It's obvious. Plenty of output, someone continuously returns again and again and again to comment on the same target group. They're fixated on that target group. Once you see depictions of Yes Chad from the neck down, it becomes more difficult to ignore the parallels with the ideal Aryan German, or the Soviet worker. He's muscular, which is supposed to suggest an inherent superiority, priorities in lifestyle, correct direction of energy and discipline, I suppose. While the people involved in these activities may think they're doing something new or novel, the tactic of negating women based on their emotionality is a tradition centuries old in the West, which is still employed. You probably recognise this picture. This photo is also quite common. This image is used to represent the negated woman in either side of an argument. Why? Because she's emotional. She's lost her cool, and it's obvious to everyone. It's not at all clear whether this common concept of emotionality as grounds for dismissal originates with an institution, in this case it'd be a business-making enterprise like a media outlet, or whether it's actually a trend among ordinary people with their own platforms, which institutions see, and then seeing the effect, seeing the way the wind's blowing, they kind of utilise that. Certainly there's something well established today, but still fairly recent, that you see in online news headlines. I'm going to give an example now. The British comedian Greg Davis was asked by an interviewer whether it was harder to do comedy now with the supposedly higher risk of offending people. We see in the article that Davis responds to this question giving his view, and that he didn't think it was. He's been given a question and he's responded to it. However, the headline reads, Greg Davis hits out. So, as the newspaper is well aware, many people will only read the headline and react to it, assuming that Davis lost his cool and got overly defensive when asked the question. Or, those who do read his response in the article, in text form only, may register that response as being said in an agitated tone of voice. So grounds for dismissal of Davis are here in place, because hits out implies an irrational and emotional response, and people will respond accordingly. I've actually got the transcript of Greg Davis's reply, which, if you go into the article, you can read. Let's take a bit of the transcript of Greg Davis's response and put it next to Crying Wojak. Okay, now, exactly the same text. Let's put that text next to Yes, Chad. So, the pop singer Dua Lipa was interviewed about her recent performances at Glastonbury. Dua Lipa seems to make the same error as Greg Davies, responding to a question when asked one. This time she's asked to respond to the suggestion that she mimed part of her Glastonbury set. Remember, actually, an interviewer only needs to make the suggestion themselves, and it has been suggested. Dua Lipa responds to this with 3 words: I don't mime. But the headline does not say she responded. It says again that she hits back. In the article itself, we read that she shrugged off the criticism, which is a lot lower key response than hitting back. For those particularly for whom her crimes are to be young, successful and female, this headline, without any investigation of the article, was enough for a declaration of open season on Dua Lipa, regardless of whether or not she mimed. This is in a time when people of that kind of disposition are much more emboldened, I guess, due to the internet, where people can inhabit a world that has Vladimir Putin in it and yet see Taylor Swift as its greatest enemy. So let's have Yes Chad asking the question and Crying Wojak giving Dua Lipa's response: I don't mime. And let's switch them round. Crying Wojak asks the question. Yes Chad answers, I don't mime. Let's put a joke in this template. Firstly with Yes Chad saying the punchline, then with Crying Wojak saying the punchline. Does that change the text and how we interpret its delivery? The power of the image. Propaganda as a term is used as an accusation. It's confirmed as a negative thing today. People can practice what is demonstrably propaganda, but will not admit to it. They're likely to accuse their target group of being propagandists, and that they are exposing them. There are accompanying narratives where even people simply of a different lifestyle, sexuality, or dietary habit are an organised brigade with an organised agenda. Even if that target group is impossibly enormous, like women, the narrative can be persuasive to those who already sympathise. Propaganda itself has a cyclical history. The term comes from the 17th century, where it was the open actions of an institution, the Roman Catholic Church. We get the name from the Pontificio Collegio Urbano de Propaganda Fide. That was in 1627, and I did that the first time. Then, by the 19th century, its methods are used not so much in institutions as in governments or churches, but in the sphere of business. To the extent, actually, that famous book from the originator, the guru of public relations, Edward Bernays, has a book that he calls Propaganda, that he wrote in the 1920s. He says that governments have fallen behind in taking up propaganda and should follow the model now of business to use propaganda methods. Well, within a decade of that book, propaganda was negative again, cycle ran again, and practiced openly by the governments that we've seen already, Soviet Union and the Third Reich. Outside of those regimes, propaganda comes under critique. George Orwell's novel Animal Farm is an allegory of Stalinist Russia, who had overthrown an empire only to become an empire in everything but name. It wasn't imperialism that was off limits, only the word empire. That paradox is right there in the title of the novel, Animal Farm. It's run by animals now, but it's still a farm. The way the pigs diffuse in that story, the way they diffuse those kind of thoughts and arguments is through words, through propaganda. Then the sheer length of the Cold War causes a propaganda fatigue. The experience of all that is thought to have diffused it, and that people just are no longer naive enough to be taken in by that kind of communication or anything as simple as using grotesque images and putting an opinion next to them. Well then, we come to today, and that is not observed to be the case. We've got crying Wojak, and yes, Chad. Kind of like in Animal Farm, it's only the word propaganda that is stigmatized, rather than necessarily the activity. I mentioned how some people would dispute any relationship to propaganda, however similar the activities are. They'll say it's only propaganda if it's done by institutions. It's certainly true that historically only institutions were able to carry out propaganda, because only institutions had access to a platform for it, and it involved the distribution of physical items, which meant the kind of expense that only an institution could run to. Now we have the internet. We all have a platform of some size and the potential to grow it. And the text and images don't need to be physical or distributed physically. Also, with it being used by so many, with so many different reasons, the reasons behind defensive and oppositional behaviour are not the impacting factor, but the defensive and oppositional behaviour itself. That's kind of, I would say, the thing that's really kind of spread among culture. Simply that to be kind of defensive and oppositional and kind of run to those kind of thoughts much quicker perhaps than we used to. The almost insistence that we must have an opponent who we will find from somewhere, if that opponent is not obvious. Opponent creation just seems to be very important. It seems to be needed by people in this time. I think that's a whole other subject which would need a whole load more time, but if we see that commonality and actually a kind of a return of the grotesque type, maybe we can see a commonality in some ways with what kind of a period in history is going to gravitate towards that that sort of form of media and that sort of employment of the power of the image. Hopefully then, like I said at the beginning, what we really see is that images are powerful. Something about sort of stopping a bit longer, analysing and breaking down what's happening when that very common thing that we do all the time, which is simply to see and interact with an image, is kind of broken down and analysed to sort of understand something about there being power there, to at least ask questions about how that power works, how is that power working on me, how can, as people obviously have done in the past, ask how can I exploit that power. Yeah, so hopefully that's been of interest. But obviously do bear in mind that I am a bald guy and I do have a beard, so perhaps you shouldn't really listen to anything I've said, or all of it should be dismissed. Don't dismiss this bit, because it's simply me saying thanks very much for watching and goodbye, and have great days until I see you next. Bye.